Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and much more. I'm your host Alberto Padoan, live from a recording studio in Zurich. Quick thanks to our sponsors, the National Centre of Competence in Research on Dependable Ubiquitous Automation, International Federation of Automatic Control, and the IEEE Control Systems Society. Our guest today is Francesco Bullo, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome to the show, Francesco.
Thank you, and greetings to everybody who may be hearing this podcast. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
And it's a great honor to have you on the show. Your work speaks for itself. I hope we will do justice to the body of work you've contributed to creating. I know that we have quite a few things in common, aside from, the geographical location of where we both come from. We seem to both like soccer and skiing. But I guess I'd like to start from the first. I was curious to learn where did you grow up and whether that affected you in the sense of how the person you became today.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for sure. I was born and raised in the city of Padua. I remember enjoying, of course, my youth and having a great time. I remember great teachers throughout elementary, middle school, high school. And then I remember selecting electrical engineering for my undergraduate degree. I remember being very well prepared and being given a rigorous education on the more scientific aspect, what we would now call the STEM disciplines throughout my high school. And I remember joining the University of Padua for my undergraduate degree and taking a healthy dose of calculus, linear algebra, and so forth. So I would say that the Italian system gave me a very rigorous and broad preparation in electrical engineering, which was a great start for my scientific career that came later.
So in fact, I was reading up in preparing this episode, the Control Systems People in Control interview that you gave some time ago. And I've seen that you studied also under Giovanni Marchesini, Giorgio Picci, and that at some point you also participated in an exchange program with UCSD. I've read that during that program you were collaborating with Professor Elias Masri, and this is actually, at least on record, what I see as the start of your endeavors in research. I was wondering, how did that affect you in general?
Yeah, you traced the main steps. I was an undergraduate student in Padua. I was taking my courses and working hard. And then I had a chance to take a linear systems theory course by Professor Marchesini, which was enlightening, inspiring, and absolutely thrilling. So I decided to focus my studies, inside electrical engineering, but on the control side, on the systems side. So then I had a chance to meet Professor Picci, who was also another great inspiration for me. And then it's great to have this opportunity. The University of California has this program, this called Education Abroad program, with universities around the world. And it turns out that this exchange program between the University was included the University of Padua as one of the partner entities. And so for my fifth year of undergraduate studies, I had a chance I applied and had a chance to then be selected to spend a year visiting one of the UC campuses. And I remember a few other friends with me at the time, and we decided that we wanted to check out San Diego. So that was a bit of a serendipitous choice. There was no rigorous thinking behind it. Well, of course, the academic excellence and the beautiful location played a role. And so then I was at UC San Diego as an education abroad program exchange student during 92, 93. And that was a great experience because I saw the American system, and we were on a quarter system and a quarter basis, so that had a different speed and feel to it. But then I was in touch with graduate courses, which in Italy at the time were not very widely established. And so I had a chance to see graduate education, interact with graduate students. And one day it was suggested to me that I would take a course with Professor Masri, who was teaching a fantastic course, or actually a sequence of courses of great interest and extremely well prepared and delivered. And so I humbly showed up at his office and asked if he would allow me into his course as an undergraduate. And I remember his stern look and his thoughtful voice telling me, Francesco, you will be competing with graduate students and you will be having difficulties, and are you really sure? And I think overall he sort of discouraged me from attending the course. It was not an advanced graduate course. I actually took that to heart, and nowadays that's what I do when I encounter a young scientist who wants to either work with me or, in any case, who aims for excellence and has a chance to do something. I will start with a little bit of a warning. It's always better to set the expectations early on and then exceed them rather than the other way around. So anyway, so I did convince him to allow me into his class, and I did well in it. And then the next quarter, we were doing an independent project, and it was off to the races. So I did an independent study with him during the spring quarter, during the third and last quarter of my stay in San Diego, which quickly turned into my first research project, and my very first publication followed thereafter. So it was really a formative experience. I went back to Padua at the end of my year abroad, definitely a transformed young student. And the year after I finished my courses, I started to do some research also with Professor Picci and other colleagues and friends. But then I think by then that was that for me. I was infected by this enthusiasm for research. There was no going back. And I definitely was very ready to apply for graduate school by the time the fall came around. And and the rest is history.
The rest is history. So I was just wanted to add one thing. You've contributed to many areas of science and engineering, but your first paper is published on the transactions on information theory, whereas I would classify you as a control theorist. In fact, I find it just very peculiar.
Well, right. This was Professor Masri's topic. He was a signal processing and information theoretician. And when I went to ask him for a problem, he asked me to study a certain algorithm.
The sign algorithm, right?
That's right. In his evaluation, this topic had not been carefully analyzed. Mm-hmm. And that's right. He described for me with disdain a paper that he had read where the key step in the proof was an approximation, which was based on inequality, and it was exactly wrong. It was the exact wrong side of the inequality. So disdain is the word with which he described the paper. And then, I was doing systems theory, but definitely signal processing and information theory were part of it. And and so luck would have it that my first paper, you're right, appeared in the transaction information theory, and we had a conference paper presented at the yearly information theory conference. Now, I think it's called a symposium. Now I forget the exact name. The Symposium on Information Theory by IEEE. So that was my first published documents came through that collaboration. It was thanks to him again and also thanks to my mentors in Padua, Professor Picci and others, thanks to them that I was able to get into my graduate school here in the US.
In fact, you mentioned also Professor Picci. I read through the records that your master thesis was developed with him on geometric control of satellites. And the main tool in order to develop this project basically is Riemannian geometry. And in fact, as you mentioned before, 1994, you moved to Caltech under the supervision of Richard Murray. And basically, you do your PhD on, I would say, nonlinear control, geometric mechanics, and robotic locomotion. What sparked your interest in this topic?
Youthful ignorance and desire to learn fun, exotic mathematical topics, and this hope to demonstrate that these tools were useful in practical engineering applications. So these tools were receiving a lot of attention by the nonlinear control community at the time. Those were the times where Alberto Isidori was traveling through Europe and the US and talking about his geometric control theory book. Arjen van der Schaaf and Henk Nijmeijer were writing their book. There was just a lot of fervor, of enthusiasm that differential geometry was important to be able to formulate all sorts of interesting problems in analysis and design of nonlinear control systems. And in particular, if you were to look at robotic applications, say, autonomous vehicle, locomotion, manipulation, that these not only just differential geometry, but also some more theories, for example, the theory of Lie groups and matrix Lie groups, and then attached to that, the theory of Riemannian geometry, where you have distances on a curved space, that these tools would be really relevant. And so we were looking at modeling and controlling the attitude, the orientation of a satellite, or all sorts of variations of that having to do with non-holonomic constraints and a number of interesting applications we were excited by. And I remember buying my first books on differential geometry and spending my time reading about the most obscure tools and ideas. And then it was natural for me to go to Caltech and work with Richard because he was definitely a proponent of this particular line of thinking. And it was great. It was an absolute thrill I started to work on geometric control of mechanical systems, the satellites, and so forth, already during my sixth and last year in Padua. And then I joined Caltech in '94, I hit the ground running because I had a clear topic in mind, and Richard was equally supportive and excited about it all. And so then we published together on, proportional derivative control on Lie groups, and then we worked versions on more abstract Riemannian manifolds, and it was definitely an exciting time.
Well, in preparing this episode, I learned many, many things. Well, first of all, lots of quotes, fantastic quotes that I've picked up from many of the works that you've published, one of which really stuck with me from the book that eventually came out of this line of research, Geometric Control of Mechanical Systems. I guess we're going to talk about it later. But one of the quotes you have there is, "Mechanics is the paradise of the mathematical sciences, because by means of it one comes to the fruits of mathematics," by Leonardo da Vinci. I didn't know it. Wonderful quote. And as you say, your focus was on mechanical systems, but through the lens of differential geometry. You mentioned that you worked on proportional derivative control in the Euclidean group. This is actually the first publication that I see on record. Extremely interesting and simple, if you wish, concept. I'd like to dig into this a little more, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. The quote that you mentioned was recommended to me and to Andrew, the co-author of our joint book on mechanical systems, by the late Jerry Marsden. So
a legend.
It was definitely a wonderful quote, and we were thrilled to have it. So physics and mathematics the history tells us that they have been developed hands in hand, physics motivating mathematical problems, and then mathematical achievements helping develop the development of physics and the discoveries of physical laws. I remember hearing a joke recently. I want to try to repeat it. Unfortunately, I don't remember who said this quote. Something along the lines of, if mathematics was removed from physics, physics would be set back by a week, said the physicist who was, full of themselves. And the mathematician said, yes, the week that would be lost is the very first one, when the universe was created. So said the mathematician. So anyway, the two fields have gone hand in hand. What was it? Maybe was it about 100 plus years ago? So I was born and raised in Padua, where Levi-Civita developed many tools of Riemannian geometry and the absolute formalism and coordinate free formalism with which he cataloged the burgeoning field of Riemannian geometry. And it's fun to remember, Levi-Civita had a large number of interactions with Albert Einstein, while Einstein was developed the theory of relativity, right? And so that's just one example of the interactions between the two. So, all right, after having quoted these absolute giants, very, very, very humbly, right, when you are dealing with a control system whose state space is naturally described by a manifold, so not just by a subset of the Euclidean space, but rather there is an actual structure that you can exploit. In this case, in the case of a satellite, in the attitude, that's the matrix Lie group, the group of orientations. Then you want to use that structure. And there are natural notions of paths on this space, of shortest paths on this space. And you use the shortest path, or better said, the direction along which the shortest path would move you, in order to define a proportional controller. So you want to go back to a particular reference location, and you do that while trying to move along the shortest path. And so once you start to think in these terms, then in fact, and using the geometry of the space, then it all makes sense, and it all can be written in a way that is coordinate-free, perhaps free of singularities, and can be understood in a geometric, coordinate-independent way.
I have lots of questions related to the subject. First of all, it makes a lot of sense to me to think about PID or PD control given a certain system, because it's, I would say, the most basic control system that one can design. But that requires the notion of error. And how to define the error, I guess, is really the essence of this body of work that you've generated together with Richard Murray on the specific set that you just mentioned before. So I guess we can call it the special Euclidean group of rigid body motions. We've encountered already Lie groups before in a previous episode with Naomi Leonard. And I recall, just for the audience, that Lie group is just a group with a smooth manifold structure. And going back to my question, how does one define the error on such sets?
Yeah, so I think everybody's familiar with the operations that exist on a vector space. And then instead on a group, the operations are a little different. There's a single operation of composition, and which in practice, when you're doing programming, boils down to multiplying two matrices together very often. So in fact, all of the Lie groups that I have encountered have all been matrix Lie groups. So one can embed this Lie group into a set of matrices, and then the composition operation is matrix product. And when you are dealing with a tracking problem, now you have two trajectories on this space, then in fact it is possible to very naturally define, either by left or right multiplication, and using the notion of inverse as well, of course, a notion of an error. Just like you would subtract a nominal from a noisy trajectory on a vector space, on a group you would, instead of subtract, using the inverse operation, and you either pre or post multiply, compose on the right or on the left. And now you have defined for yourself a notion of an error, an object, which again lives on the matrix Lie group. And then you can study how it evolves. You can write down the dynamics of the error, and then in the dynamics of the error there will be the dynamics of the system, and there will be perhaps the higher order derivatives of the reference trajectory that you wish to follow, and so forth. So that's the start, and then you follow your nose and you trace through the calculations and you design your controller. So that's pretty much what we were doing those years, both on matrix Lie groups, so the group of rotation, the special Euclidean group of displacements, so that is to say rotation and translations, in 2 and 3 dimensions. In fact, you can do this on arbitrary Lie groups without having to be specific about which one it is that you are dealing with. We were doing that. We did also a little paper on the sphere, thinking about pointing and targeting problems, and it's the same set of concepts. I do teach robotics to undergraduate students here at Santa Barbara, and I've developed a number of little devices to get them interested in the theory of Lie groups. And so if you have in front of you an object, say for example your phone, it has 3 main axes, and if you do think about these 3 angles called roll, pitch, and yaw, then you should be able to recreate the following operation. If you pitch up by 90 degrees and then you roll by 90, and then you pitch down by 90 degrees, you will have achieved a rotation by yaw of 90 degrees. So I always play this game in class, and I make the case to the students that when you are dealing with these spaces, with these non-Euclidean spaces, you cannot just sum angles with one another. You really need to understand the compositional operation on the Lie group, which enables all of this beautiful geometry and useful calculations.
Yeah, in fact, then, as you say, you also said it before, you generalize these concepts to tracking for fully actuated mechanical systems, so something way more general than just the special Euclidean group. But I guess my broad question would be more, what is the advantage for those who are not, let's say, versed in differential geometry in working in a coordinate-free way?
Well, that's a great question, and that goes at the heart of how much value does the differential geometric approach to control theory have? Are these tools useful or maybe ultimately not? So, I have confronted myself with such questions throughout my entire career, right? You come to these engineering problems with a bit of a mathematical mind frame, and in mathematics, you always pursue generality for its sake of its own generality, as just as a mathematical objective. And in reality, the value of a theory is proportional to the number of examples and applications and extensions that one can devise. So if I can only understand the behavior of a satellite, then why go to such extremes as to study Riemannian geometry? Maybe you just simply, work out the specific example and you're done. And certainly if you are working at a company and you do have to control a single satellite, there is really nothing wrong with just, dealing with the problem at hand and focusing on it. However, if you are a scientist and you wish to truly understand why do things work, under what are the necessary assumptions that allow you to still perform the same control design and mathematical analysis, and you, as I said, you wish to generalize to more examples, then in fact, understanding these more abstract mathematical tools is useful. So Lie groups, for example, well, they are very relevant in a number of fields. Matrix Lie groups, well, okay, if you are studying robotics, then knowing how to manipulate the position and rotation of an object in a three-dimensional space seems to be a rather elementary thing that you absolutely must be able to do. Whether you're doing proportional derivative control over satellite, or you are designing a virtual world for your brand new digital vision systems, or you are understanding the vestibular system in medicine, and so on and so forth. So being able to reason about the geometric space around us is very critical. Ordinary differential equations and partial differential equations with symmetries, with invariant properties, are widely studied and they're very relevant. So it comes together, right? Even nowadays, you can look at machine learning problems where you have data that has to be interpreted. You look, for example, maybe you have imagery of an object and you would want your machine learning algorithm to be capable of recognizing the object independently of its orientation, right? So maybe you wish to understand the image under all sorts of transformations of the image, which, maybe scaling and rotations and so forth, and reflection. The objects in the image are invariant, so you should be able to design algorithms that are invariant under the action of this Lie group. So these mathematical tools are, they are recurrent. So you will find them even 30 years into your career, looking at other problems. Riemannian geometry is the same. This is a language that permeates much of modern mathematics, and being able to understand curve spaces is at the heart of a number of algorithms. Well, we said relativity in physics and more. So that's the value of abstraction. So to come to completion, back to your question. So it turns out that the ability of performing proportional derivative control and correctly calculating the feed-forward term that allows you to exactly track a trajectory, that can be done on Lie group using those properties of Lie groups, but it turns out that it can be done in even more general spaces with an appropriate construction, using something called exponential coordinates and using something called a mapping on a tangent bundle. So there's a little bit of structure that one wants to understand, but that's what we were doing at the time. Yeah.
You made two very important points. So one is the value also of examples. I've seen throughout your career and throughout the body of work you generated that there are always motivating examples that motivate your research. In this context, I would say many robotics examples, for example, satellites with thrusters, underwater vehicles, planar bodies, appear throughout, let's say, the period where you focus on this subject. And also, as you say, the importance of knowing a language. So once you learned the language of Riemannian geometry, you spawn in many different directions and you explored not only proportional derivative control on Lie groups, but as you said, you teamed up also with Andy Lewis, working on controllability and motion algorithms for underactuated Lagrangian systems on Lie groups, also together with Naomi Leonard. You work on control on the sphere for attitude stabilization, kinematic controllability, series expansions, averaging. I'm curious about what sort of works in this area are you particularly proud of?
Oh, that's a tough question, Alberto. So when I was born as a scientist, as I said earlier, first I had a chance to work with Professor Masri, but then in reality, my main topic was differential geometry. I wanted to use those tools, Lie groups, understanding the dynamics of mechanical systems. And maybe the work that I'm most proud at the end of the day is jumping through all of these individual papers, is the book that I wrote with my good friend Andrew Lewis, sort of like at the end of all of this thread of work. So, I graduated in 98, and then I kept working on mechanical systems and publishing on these topics for another few years, still had paper 99, 2000, 2001, 2002. And at that time, I began writing a book. And each of those works found its way onto a chapter in the book. And the book, I think, came out in 2004. And it was really a big effort for Andrew and I. I learned a lot from working with Andrew in terms of rigorously thinking and developing a document that would provide a comprehensive coverage of everything we knew and more or less was known at that time in this area of control theory for mechanical systems. So yes, I would say by far, I enjoyed, and it was fantastic to collaborate with all of my collaborators, with Naomi. Maybe I won't wish to talk about her in a second, with Naomi, and then with Milos and with Kevin Lynch and Milos Zafran over those years. But maybe the one document I'm most proud of is the book. So maybe let me jump off for a second on a tangent. But while I was a graduate student, I did have a chance to work with Richard, and I'm extremely thankful to him for mentoring me and for allowing me to make all sorts of mistakes and all sorts of as I said earlier, youthful exuberance, and always being supportive, which was great. And one of the things he supported me with was, I remember his recommendation or his suggestion that I would spend some time visiting Naomi Leonard at Princeton at the time. And so while I was a PhD student at Caltech, having a great time with Richard and with Jerry Marsden and John Doyle and many other incredible faculty and scientists, I also had a chance to travel 2 summers. I went to visit Naomi at Princeton, and that was also really formative and great to have a chance to work with another fantastic scientist at the time. And so she and I had a chance to work on designing small amplitude control signals that would slowly but surely, move your underactuated system in a particular direction, along a particular trajectory. And so that was also very formative. And I think both of them, it was great to have a chance to work with such giants during my studies.
So, as you say, Geometric Control of Mechanical Systems, the book, the first book that you wrote, there will be a link in the description, of course. I cannot recommend it more than, if anybody has an interest in the subject, they should check it out. It's 750 pages of very careful and rigorous presentation on the subject. I heard that you had this dream to have a textbook on graduates in mathematics. Is that a true anecdote, or? But eventually,
it's true. Yes,
you succeeded.
It is true. Yeah, I even as a student, I was maybe fascinated by books. I think I was unconsciously fascinated. I remember early on deciding I would like to remain in academia. I would like to become a professor. I would like to do work on geometric control. I would like people to know it, to be able to have an impact in the field. And I would like to write my own book on it. And if at all, the joke is that when you're young and you set yourself an objective, make sure it is ambitious enough so that you don't achieve it a little too early in your career. So if at all, I would say that finishing my book in 2003 and 2004 was great and was a culmination of about a decade worth of work. And then there was a moment when I looked at myself and I said, okay, what's next now? What do I do? Because that was a little bit of I think I'll use the word dream, a little bit of a dream as a young undergraduate student. And then 10 years later, you're a faculty and you have done it. So what is your bigger and longer term objective? So that took me a while. I'm still trying to figure it out, by the way.
So as you say, in 1998, you graduate, you get your PhD. Actually, I have a question related to this, but from Caltech, you moved to Urbana-Champaign. And I would call this new phase as, from single robots to robotic networks, almost that, it's the start of a new journey. Obviously, as you said, you continue publishing on the subject of geometric control of mechanical systems. And I'd have a question related to the influence of the many thinkers that you interacted with at Caltech during those years. I've read in your PhD thesis, in the acknowledgements, there's an impressive list of VIPs, if you wish, in control from, as you say, Richard Murray, Naomi Leonard, but also Jerry Marsden, John Doyle, Pablo Parrillo, Sanjay Lal, Pietro Perona, Andrew Lewis. Plenty of great thinkers, I would say. How did that affect you also in your trajectory?
It was a fantastic starting point. Those years at Caltech, there were the first years of the new program, the new graduate program on controlling, was entitled Controlling Dynamical Systems. It's still in existence now. We celebrated the 25th anniversary a while back, and we're creeping up on the 35th anniversary. So it was great. It was very formative. It was important. It's important to have a group of people and not really be alone, right? If there's one thing that I maybe don't love completely about research is that sometimes you're doing it alone. I'm a very social animal. Well, right now as a professor, I absolutely love working with my students. At the time, I was a student and I enjoyed, having a chance to talk to my advisors, my mentors, Richard most of all, but then I had a chance to take courses from John and Jerry. I had a chance to take courses and talk many times with Jerry Marsden. That was also a very influential person for me. And then Naomi, and then also with my, classmates, with my colleagues who were doing a PhD or a postdoc during those same years. And so the names you listed, including in particular, for example, with Andrew, who was a PhD student with me, then of course we ended up collaborating for years later and published the book together. And, I think if you were to want to get a PhD in systems and control nowadays, again, it's fantastic to work with a great mentor, but it's also important just having a group of people around you with like-minded interests, and really makes the PhD marathon become a much more enjoyable run and set of achievements. So I think that was there at the time at the Caltech. Having that environment was very helpful, of course.
So we were saying before that in 1998 you moved from Caltech to Urbana-Champaign. And according to the records here, I see what seems to be an important event. You interact with Manuel de León from Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. And this interaction brings you to, again, in turn, interact with Jorge Cortés and Sonia Martinez, who then become, respectively, I believe, a postdoctoral fellow working with you, and Sonia Martinez, a PhD student. And this collaboration, obviously, a posteriori, we can say it was extremely fruitful. I'm curious about how did all happen and what did that bring?
Yeah, how did that come to be? So the way it came to be was that I had a website where I put some preprints. And it turns out that if memory serves me right, I believe Jorge and Sonia, so Jorge Cortés, who's now a professor at UC San Diego, well, they're both now professors at UC San Diego. Jorge Cortés and Sonia Martinez, they read my preprints, and they're the ones who reached out to me. And they said, we're doing our PhD in Spain, in Madrid, and we would like to come to visit. That was great. That was the start of a brilliant collaboration, of a deep friendship, and of many years of camaraderie working on these problems. So they were also coming from a mathematical background. They also had the same desire to have an impact in an engineering discipline, such as systems and control. And yeah, I remember them visiting me in Urbana-Champaign at the University of Illinois when I was doing my tenure track years, having a great time. And then I remember traveling to Spain and meeting their advisor there and spending good time together. And then, so they came to visit, both of them came to visit during their PhD. I was not officially their PhD mentor, although, as I love to say, I did mentor them during their PhDs. And then they both decided that they wanted to continue their career in the US. And so then they, I believe Sonia received a Fulbright fellowship, and Jorge instead, I think I was able to support him a little while myself as a postdoc. He did a postdoc with Professor van der Schaft before me. And then they both was slightly, they were slightly off by a year or two. They obtained faculty position. First, Jorge was at UC Santa Cruz, and then they both got positions at UC San Diego, which was a great achievement for them at the time. And it was a great joy for me to see that happen. Yeah, Sonia and Jorge were great. It was fantastic to have them work with me for that long time. We started by working on mechanical systems because we have papers with them on controllability, on series expansions, on a set of topics on oscillatory signals that we were interested in. Those were topics that were still steeped and embedded in geometric control theory. And then one nice day, we started to think that perhaps we should also do something else, that perhaps we should also look at what other people were interested in and were working on those days. And those were the days where, if you were looking at robotic applications, people were beginning to say, well, okay, now that we can build one flying robot, what about if we have 5 of them? What about if we have maybe a few moving information? What if we have a very large number, maybe a swarm? What if we have a network of them? And I remember sitting down with them and just sketching little ideas on a piece of paper, just trying to think about what would you want to say about such a problem? What would you want to understand? And one thing led to another, and we started to write about simple behaviors, simple interaction behaviors between robots, and how to understand the emerging from these simple interactions, what emerging large-scale behavior would emerge. And we started to work on networks. We started to work on groups of robots. And the first paper that we wrote was not the very first thing we thought of. We had a bunch of scrap paper with all sorts of ideas that led to absolutely nowhere. But the first paper was also a bit of a serendipitous coincidence. You have a bookcase full of books, and you look at random topics, and we were thinking about, robots that move around and that that are in charge of different tasks, of different activities, and maybe they are sharing amongst each other the space in which they live. And then we got our hands on a book on something called Voronoi tessellations, which is also an absolutely elegant geometric subject. It's, I would say much more on the computational geometry rather than differential geometry. So it's really not the same, but there's some thinking that is aligned and that is elegant and, mathematically appealing. And so we got our hands on this book by some Japanese authors. I have it on my shelf, but I don't remember the name of the authors right now. No matter the names, it's a very widely cited book on Voronoi tessellations. And if memory serves me right, we were scrolling through it, Sonia and I, one day, with Jorge next to us. And then we looked at it and we said, well, this is chapter 9. I see an explicit formula for precisely the gradients of a cost function that we had been wondering about. And that gradient, one was able to compute that particular gradient only using local information. And so it really was the serendipitous discovery on one nice day, well, that came after some brainstorming and some work, that led us to write a paper on coverage control, we decided to call it, that is essentially discussing how you can partition a space using this logic, this algorithm called the Voronoi partitioning algorithm. In fact, it's a specific algorithm, but it can be generalized to arbitrary notions of distances and arbitrary spaces. So then you can, go off to the races and write all sorts of variations of it. Yeah, and we sent that to the transaction on robotics, and it was a immediate success. People really liked that. It was the first time that I began to give talks about something that people could actually understand, the first time they would hear it. And, after a decade trying to teach my graduate students and give talks on Riemannian geometry, it was a refreshing change to just be able to talk to people as opposed to be able to only talk to Riemannian geometers. And and that was also very timely. It was a very hot topic at that moment of historical development of the control community. And so we received lots of recognition and accolades. And that, by the way, that's also what helped Sonia and Jorge getting their positions at San Diego. And perhaps, if memory serves me right, that's also the topic that I discussed in my job talk here at Santa Barbara. So that's also what allowed me to get here. Yeah, so it took a little bit of ingenuity, and we were looking around and trying to find some ways to formalize and then generalize in this early field of, autonomous system, multi-agent systems and control. I remember at the time people were doing information control and other variations. So that's how it came about. And then one nice thing about that particular paper was that it was a simple idea. It was very easy to communicate and very, very easy to generalize and extend in countless other ways, very few of which we did ourselves, and then many others were done by the community later on. So that's the story there.
It's very cool. As you say, the paper is, I repeat it for the audience, coverage control for mobile sensing networks. There will be a link in the description, of course. And the benefits of the gradient descent-based algorithms that you propose is that they're adaptive, they're distributed, they're asynchronous, and you can verifiably give some guarantees about the closed-loop behaviors of those algorithms. As you mentioned, many papers follow from this stream of research. I learned a lot in reading some of the papers. Perhaps the one that struck me the most is the one about the art gallery problem that I didn't know about. It's wonderful because it can also be stated very simply. So we are in an art gallery and we're asking what is the minimum number of guards who together can observe the whole gallery. There is a paper dedicated to this and that won the Best Paper Award at ACC, the American Control Conference in 2006, called Distributed Deployment of Asynchronous Guards in an Art Gallery. I'll let you describe what that is. I found it extremely fascinating, very elegant and simple, but also powerful in a way.
Yeah, that's a fun paper. I sometimes forget about it. Yeah, that was the work of one of my first, if not the first PhD student I work with, and as you know, officially mentored by me, that was Anurag Ganguly. And basically the idea is you start by thinking, what does it mean to have multiple agents live in a common workspace and therefore share a task together. And then you realize that then you study the geometry space, which is, the structure that you wish to use when you're thinking about controls. And we were fascinated by this art gallery problem. It is one of the most elegant problems that you will find discussed in any undergraduate text on computational geometry, right? And exactly like you said, Alberto, it's about, from a computational geometry point of view, the problem is, how do I minimize the number of guards? So a guard is a point in a polygon. The polygon is not necessarily convex. If it is convex, just one guard will suffice to observe every point in the space. But of course, if you think about the floor plan of the building in which you reside, or if you think about the streets in a downtown area with buildings obstructing your view, those spaces are not convex. And those spaces are, a real space is very complicated to describe. But to begin with, you can start by thinking about a polygon that is not convex. Perhaps it has some holes. And now you're thinking about, the computational geometry problem is what is the minimum number, but also where to place them. And then if you think about how do you take that static optimization problem and how do you envision a group of robots solving that problem, then you quickly realize, the robots are going to enter the environment from some location, and you want them to deploy in such a way as to achieve full coverage, full visibility coverage we were trying to explain at the time. That is to say, you wish to ensure that after the robots have deployed themselves, then every point in the environment is visible by at least one of the robots. So now, again, if you're thinking about, in this whole area, you can always think about, I have a centralized computer. The computer knows the entire environment. It controls every single robot. The computer could solve an art gallery problem offline and could determine the coordinates of the locations and then send them as commands as reference points to each of the robots. And that's the solution. And fine, right? That's an okay solution. Maybe it is the best solution in some cases, but in other cases, you may be in a situation where you don't want to have a single point of failure, where you wish to have something that would be able to reconfigure and adapt if an individual robot were to fail. Maybe you don't know the environment until you observe it and explore it. And so then you end up asking yourself the question, imagine I open the door into this house, or imagine I enter this museum. It's again called the art gallery problem. How do I move one robot at a time in an incremental way so that they go everywhere? And so that was a cute problem. These computational geometry problems, they can be complicated. They can be not so easy. So we did the planar problem with Anurag in that paper. I'm sure you're right. I don't remember the exact year. I'm sure you're right. It was 2006. Later on, I also worked with another student, Karl Obermeier, and we wrote an even more elaborate version, a more elegant version of a similar problem. I remember joking with Karl. Karl was, again, another PhD student of mine. And I remember joking with Karl, saying something like, I looked away from him because I did not want him to see me smile, because after 2 years worth of work, we finished the paper classifying all possible cases, cataloging all of the possible degenerate situations, and writing an algorithm completely imperfect mathematical analysis of all of the complications that could arise, and classifying it all and finishing the paper. And then I turned around so that he wouldn't see my face, and I said, Karl, now all that it requires of you before you can graduate is do the 3D version of the 2D problem, which is 2 orders of magnitude more complicated. And I remember turning around and he was frozen right there and rather scared by that joke. And then I said, of course I'm joking. Let's not, make that a road stop on your way to graduation and to getting a great job. Yeah, so we explored all sorts of variations. And I remember during those years also writing various heuristics and generating some exciting movies of all sorts of behaviors that we were not really ultimately able to fully analyze. So we published a lot. It was a great time. We worked on a lot of variations of this coverage problem. Yeah, and then we left the field.
From here onwards, as you say, you start exploring many different problems that are related to robotic networks. So routing problems, for example, not only coverage problems, deployment. It's quite difficult in the time we have to do justice to this whole body of work. I refer people here on the podcast to some papers that I find personally representative, but I'd be also curious to hear your opinion. One is certainly motion coordination with distributed information with Sonia Martinez and Jorge Cortés on the Control Systems magazine journal. Another one is on traveling salesperson problems for Dubin's vehicles, stochastic and dynamic environments. This is with Ketan Savla and Emilio Frazzoli, who I believe was also at Urbana-Champaign at the time. Are there any particular works in this area that you would suggest to our audience?
I think the Control Systems paper, the magazine, right, in 2007 with Sonia and Jorge, that contained a very nice summary of many years' worth of work with them. Essentially, ultimately, it's about understanding many examples of gradient-based algorithms for coordination. And when is the gradient distributed so that it can be implemented in a distributed way. So that was definitely a wonderful summary that we wrote. I also enjoyed very much the paper with Jorge on... With Jorge, we wrote a paper on non-smooth versions of this problem, on something called sphere packing and disk covering. And so we wrote that. So that was a very interesting variation going into the world of non-smooth dynamics and then finding lots of exciting both robotic behaviors and resulting cost functions. And I think Jorge then had a chance to continue and really make fantastic headway in understanding non-smooth dynamics. And then you mentioned Ketan. Another group of fantastic people I work with was Ketan Savla, my PhD student, and then I also work with Steve Smith, another PhD student of mine, and with Marco Pavone and Emilio Frazzoli. And so basically what happened is that we got interested in, with Ketan, we got interested in designing trajectories for vehicles to travel through an environment and service customers that would appear through an environment. This should sound similar to the way in which a taxi company works, and it is in fact meant to be that. So you look at an environment, events occur, a customer appears and requires a service, and now how do you route the vehicle or the vehicles to provide the service? And so we refer to this set of problems as routing problem, dynamic routing for vehicles, right? And so I did work on that first with Ketan, and then Ketan graduated. I worked with that with Steven, and then collaborated with Marco Pavone, who was a PhD student working with Emilio Frazzoli. Emilio was a colleague I had met at the University of Illinois, and then we both moved to California. I came to Santa Barbara, and he was at UCLA. And we wrote a sequence of papers. And finally, the one document, maybe with the summary of it all, is a paper that appeared in the proceedings of the IEEE a few years later in 2011, I seem to remember. And in that paper, there's a summary of that line of work. So that was also, I would say that's also a nice chapter of work. Yeah.
Obviously, there will be a link in the description also to this paper, Dynamic Vehicle Routing for Robotic Systems, invited paper on the proceedings on IEEE. And also, I would say another book that you published with Jorge and Sonia on robotic networks. The title is Distributed Control of Robotic Networks. Again, there will be a link in the description. But I'd like to move on at this stage because it seems like, again, 2004, more or less, you move back to California, to UC Santa Barbara, as you say. And at some point, I see another phase transition, if you want, in your career, whereby the interest shifts not only from networks of robots, but generally networked systems of all sorts of types, be them smart grids, systems that are interconnected and may suffer from cyber attacks. And later on, I hope we will also talk about sociology, mathematical sociology, social systems. I'm curious about what attracted your interest to, let's say, networks in general.
It felt like a very natural development, Alberto. So we were working on robotic networks and understanding distributed systems for the purpose of doing motion coordination. And then, well, I should say, I also love to teach about the topics, right, that I do research on. And I'm very thankful here at Santa Barbara. We are on the quarter system, and I have a lot of freedom to develop new courses. And so I think part of it was, okay, again, in the spirit of generalization and mathematical abstraction, all right, now that you have written all these laws for robotics and for multi-robot systems, then, what else can you do with them? Or can they be understood in more general terms? A little bit of that, if you were to teach it to students, what would be the basics that you would teach? And those were the years, I think I started maybe in 2012 to write my third book on network systems, lectures on network systems. I started to teach a course every year. And, another aspect, there's just the times were changing, right? I mean, there was, all of a sudden, there was an enormous interest in, network systems became very interesting. Network systems understood in a very wide sense. So we were working on robotics, but then there were many analogies with mathematical sociology, like you just hinted. So understanding opinion dynamics. And, that's the beauty of control theory. That's to say, of systems and control. That's to say that after you've written a paper on robotic coordination, you can turn around and read up on opinion dynamics and mathematical sociology, and you can try to use the same mathematical tools and understanding to a different domain. And then you go back and you try to ask yourself the question, okay, if I were to teach it to a graduate student or maybe even a first-year graduate student, what would be the key ideas that would inform the student to be able to understand both fields? And at the same time, also, we haven't talked so far about it, but it is, of course, really relevant, is what are the funding agencies and what is the community interested in? It's always a little bit of a pull and a push. The funding agencies have an interest in new topics, and so they push you towards a new topic. But unless the community can make progress on those new topics, then there is really nothing to be funded. And so I think during those years, not just me, but the whole control community made exciting progress on distributed algorithms. Consensus algorithms became absolutely dominant in the field. It was a way of, in fact, the control community should get credit for that, because we were the ones who developed that, and it became very relevant in a number of other disciplines, signal processing, information theory. And then from there was born the field of distributed optimization. And so those same ideas then reverberated in many communities. And I played my little role in that whole development. But you're right to describe it as first it was also a natural progression. First I studied differential geometry for, locomotion, then I got interested in groups of robots, and then slowly but surely we recognized, and I say we because it looks like it was me, but the reality is that all the work I've done with my PhD students, we recognized that the key idea in there was networks, distributed systems, multi-agent systems, and that was what was driving the field. Therefore, yes, robotic networks, but also opinion dynamics and mathematical sociology, and then a little bit more or less at the same time frame, maybe a tiny bit later, we got interested in distributed optimization, and then in coupled oscillators, power grids, and so on and so forth. Nowadays, another 10 years later, I'm interested in neural networks. And another point of view is, those were also the years where I started to read papers published in broader venues. So, papers published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, or Nature Communication, or Science Advances. Well, Science Advances didn't exist at the time, but these broad journals that have dissemination outside and then of just the field of controls. And I found that to be an interesting exercise to confront yourself with these bigger dimensions, with a larger scientific community, especially physicists and so forth. And if you do go to read papers in PNAS and Science or Nature and all of their variants, and you ask yourself the question, what are papers in there which have dynamical systems and controls and optimization? Well, you will find out that a great fraction of them focus on networks. So the keyword is network. So And so you start to, understand that was also the time where the field of network science, not as a subset of control theory, was coming to the fore. And exciting time. And I think after I finished, this is also the way academia works. After Jorge and Sonia left me, and then Ketan and Steve, graduated, and Carl graduated, Anurag graduated, and many others, very talented PhD students. I mentioned Carl and then Vaibhav and Giuseppe. Then after that, we looked at more general network systems. So there was a transition, like you said, like a phase transition. And with my students, we got interested in general problems over networks. And that was fun.
So before we actually dig into neural networks and the related topic of contraction theory that you seem to be most excited about.
That's right.
I'd like to dig into the subject of network systems a bit more, at least touching on some topics that I find interesting. One of them is security in control systems. As you mentioned, there was a great excitement about the subject of consensus at the time. So how does a group of agents reach consensus on a certain quantity of interest? And there's one paper that seems to start the topic of security with one of the triple F trio, I would call it, Francesco, Fabio, and Florian, and seems to be have become very successful. The paper is called On the Security of Linear Consensus Networks. This seems to be the first interaction that you had with Fabio Pasqualetti together with Antonio Bicchi at CDC 2009. And this is really the start of a journey into regarding, if you wish, cyber attacks using tools from control.
That's right. Yes. As I mentioned earlier, I could describe my research career as a function of the young scientists with whom I collaborated on those topics. And so every new PhD student essentially is a new chapter. And the one you just mentioned is a truly exciting one. So Fabio, another extremely talented PhD student I work with, he joined my group. And at the time he joined my group, we were already doing consensus algorithms with all sorts of different applications. So, but when he arrived, he had just taken the classic courses on linear geometric control in Italy based on the book by Marro, and then understanding a classic stream of topics having to do with geometric notions of subspaces that are observable, detectable, and that lead to disturbance attenuation, that lead to fault detection, and so forth. And so then, literally, Fabio's PhD, Fabio was an extremely prolific student, so he worked on many different topics, but the mainstream was really trying to understand how to bring together classic results from the geometric theory of linear systems, geometric linear systems theory, onto the field of security in a system, in a network system, right, of network security. And so Fabio wrote a sequence of papers that all were very well received on these topics, on variations of these topics. And then finally, the capstone maybe of that sequence of papers was the paper that he wrote with Florian as well on security, right, in the transactions on automatic control. Now I forget the exact year it appeared, but we wrote a paper for TAC, and then we wrote a paper for the Control System magazine as well. And I'll come back to Florian's incredible achievements as a PhD student later, but that was, again, a summary paper that culminated multiple years of work in bringing together models of linear systems and networks of linear systems subject to a variety of possible attacks, and using rigorous notions to define and classify the various cases. And then after you've modeled and analyzed, then also, of course, designing various both defense strategies and attack strategies, respectively, for those systems. So very proud of that line of work, very exciting. What happened is, it was a little bit of a serendipitous. It was a great time in my lab, and while Fabio was doing all of the security work, Florian had joined my group, and he had charted his own independent and rich and incredibly successful path, studying power grids and coupled oscillators. Again, now you may say, what does that have to do with everything else we've talked about before? Well, it turns out that if you write down the equations for a network of coupled oscillators, then in fact the mathematical aspects are not completely unrelated. They're related. And if you think long and hard about it, you will understand that in fact there's a lot of commonality with consensus algorithms, with formation control, with coverage control, and so forth. And so Florian came exactly from the robotics field. And I remember an early conversation saying, well, do you want to still do robotics or do you want to think about something else? And the following time he came to me and he said, well, I looked at these Kuramoto models and it looks to me like they're very similar. And look at this change of coordinates and transformation, you get the same equations. And from there on, it was off to the races and very exciting work on coupled oscillators and their relevance in the study of power grids. And then a couple of years later, after both Fabio and Florian were very successful, one nice day, they started to talk to each other and identifying security problems in power systems. And then off we three went, writing papers on that topic as well. So that was a very exciting time, of course, and a very successful time as well. And then both of them went on to, amazing research careers after leaving my group.
So just a couple of clarifications for our audience. One of the papers you're mentioning, so the one together with Fabio Pasqualetti and Florian Dörfler, is Attack Detection and Identification in Cyber-Physical Systems, appeared on the Transactions of Automatic Control. There will be a link in the description, of course. As you say, the test case here are power grids, I imagine, and the main idea is to identify cyber attacks via these concepts coming from linear geometric control, and essentially pairing the notion of observability and detectability with attacks being detected or not. And Florian instead goes on to linking the dynamics of Kuramoto oscillators, which could be regarded as consensus on the circle, so on a manifold, with the swing equations which describe the dynamics of power networks. There's many other exciting things that I'd like to talk about, including, for example, a paper on controllability metrics that was also written by Fabio Pasqualetti and Sandro Zampieri.
That's right. But Sandro was visiting,
at the University of Padova. Honestly, it's quite difficult to decide on my end because I'd also like to talk about mathematical sociology and contraction theory. These are all important topics, I believe, to you or have been. I'll let you choose which one you want to talk about.
Let me maybe give you a summary of some of the other things I've done. So I was lucky to meet and collaborate with a sociologist here at Santa Barbara. And so then I learned another exciting thing you can do in your scientific career is try to reach out and really try to work hard to collaborate with people with a very different background. And so that was in a different way, but that was also very satisfactory. And I collaborated with Noah for about a decade. That was great in the area of mathematical sociology. Learned from him a ton, and we published a number of papers together, mathematical sociology. So before I jump into what I'm doing right now, then I also had the pleasure of hosting my good friend Sandro Zampieri from the University of Padua. So he came, he spent his sabbatical here with us, and Fabio was here. And again, it's one of those things where, there's a paper in Science on controllability of network systems, and that the problem is in the air, and it's like you read the papers around and you're like, well, these are great papers, we're very respectful, but I don't know, this doesn't make sense. So always creatively looking at a new angle. And Fabio and Sandro did a fantastic job that year working on controllability metrics and understanding not just the binary controllability question, is the system controllable or not, but also really understanding that it's not a binary problem. It has to do with how much energy does it take for you to control your network system from one place to another. So maybe I can focus my answer on what it is that I'm doing nowadays and how did I come to it. And so what happened is that I was telling you earlier, I taught a decade worth of courses on network systems, but mainly linear network systems. And I remember as an anecdote a meeting with my group of PhD students where we brainstormed about what should I be teaching next? What would be, what should we be moving into? And I remember discussing this with my students at the time and thinking, okay, well, why don't we try to look at general nonlinear methodologies to be able to capture a large number of nonlinear network systems? Because whether you're looking at mathematical sociology or power grids, robotics, but then many other fields, epidemiology and neural networks as well, right? You can understand a lot by knowing linear network systems theory, understanding even traffic flows and so forth. However, at the same time, you also want to really capture the nonlinearities present in there. And so I remember teaching a course where the very first course on nonlinear network systems was a bit of a mix of topics. So some examples, in nonlinear systems theory, the key problem is you have to find the Lyapunov function. It's like a zoo. So you look at 10 different examples. Okay, power grids. Okay, swing equation in power grids, balancing problem in mathematical sociology, opinion dynamics in mathematical sociology, formation control, coverage control. And you write down 10 examples, the Hopfield neural network model, the network epidemic model. You write down all of these nonlinear network systems, and if you find them from different fields, you end up with 10 different sets of equations or more even. And then you start to think about, how am I going to teach this? And you start to say, well, I need to design Lyapunov functions for each of them. And then you start to say, but wasn't there a commonality? Wasn't there a way? If I were to have to teach this, are these 10 different independent chapters? Is this just a zoo of different animals with apparently no relationship between them? Or is there a way in which you can teach something that covers multiple fields and that you find a common thread? And so baseline, ultimately everything is a Lyapunov function. And then another field that is very successful and we investigated and that I taught is the theory of passive and dissipative systems. And that was very interesting, but for the examples that I had in mind at the time, I felt that did not quite directly apply as I wanted it to apply. And then the third topic that I looked at and that I realized I was interested in was the topic of contraction theory. So understanding, well, and one would argue maybe the Lyapunov functions that come up in the field of contraction theory. And the more I looked into that topic, the more I found good examples, good theory to be developed, good application areas. And then again, there I was off to the races, writing papers, writing a book, teaching a course, giving lectures, graduating PhD students, and so on and so forth. And so, contraction theory is another point, an equivalent point of view is incremental stability notions. So now the focus is on understanding the stability of trajectories instead of individual points. And in particular, looking at Lyapunov functions that arise from notions of metrics and distances. And so many of the people who are listening to this podcast may know of the basic result called Banach contraction theorem, which is the most commonly studied and used tool in mathematical analysis to understand all of your favorite theorems you studied in calculus on implicit function theorem, inverse function theorem, existence and uniqueness of solutions of differential equations, and so on and so forth. All of those results can be understood as Banach contractions. And it turns out that I would argue that this is a field now that is very rich. There is a very rich theory, basic theory. There are very many examples. I'll come back to the examples in a second. There are, if you understand, there are a large number of properties of contracting dynamical systems. So you can essentially take any book on nonlinear systems theory and write a version of it for contracting dynamics, where you make slightly stronger assumptions on the dynamics, because now it's not only Lyapunov stable, it is actually contracting. So it's a stronger assumption, which one would argue therefore limits its applicability. But on the other hand, I can find many examples of systems which just so happen to be satisfying that stronger condition. So then why why not? If it's applicable, it's worthy of investigation. And then you get for free a large number of properties. And among the properties that you get are many properties having to do with robustness to unmodeled dynamics, to modularity and compositions and interconnections of nonlinear contracting systems, as well as computational properties, things such as if you perform a forward Euler discretization of a continuous time contracting dynamics, you get a discrete time contracting algorithm, and there is a converse theorem, vice versa. So a number of computational, if you wish to know convergence times, and regions, if you wish to understand the impact of model dynamics or a disturbance or in a variety of setting, everything in the context of contraction theory can be rather explicit, can be very computationally friendly and explicit. And so I usually joke when I give a talk on this topic, if you remember your basic definitions of stability, they start with a dreaded, for all epsilon there exists a delta.
Yes.
Or even in modern nonlinear systems theory, given the existence of a class K and class KL function, then your system has the following properties and so on and so forth. And so the joke is that epsilon and delta and the class K functions, these objects are anonymous. They don't have a real name. You don't know what is this epsilon, how much is delta, what does it mean, a function, this monotonic function? Well, there are an infinite number of them. So which one is it that you have proved your incremental, your ISS property with respect to? And instead, for a class of systems, not all systems, but there are many examples which we can discuss right now, you can in fact establish rather explicit contractivity properties with Lipschitz constants. So you now have Lipschitz constants to calculate with. So the size of the error of a system with a contraction rate C, subject with a disturbance described by a Lipschitz constant L, well then the ultimate error is of size L over C. And the time it takes you to go there, well, that's proportional to the time constant, which is 1 over C. And if you're trying to track an equilibrium that is moving with a certain speed, then the constant will be L over C squared. So they're not anonymous, they're quantities that you can calculate. And so now, as I mentioned earlier in this podcast, the value of the theory is ultimately proportional to the number of examples that you can understand with that theory. And so there I go with my new interest in neural networks. And we've been doing the work. I think I also used this word earlier in the podcast of archaeology. Let me explain what I mean by that, Alberto. So we are in the year 2024. People were writing papers on neural networks, dynamical systems, and control, I don't know, in the middle of the last century, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. How many papers have appeared on control theory in the last 60, 70 years? And the rate is exploding, right? So now, none of us, I will be the first to admit, no, but certainly for me, I have not read every possible paper out there in the literature on any of this topic. So you want to write a book on contraction theory, you want to explain contractivity of neural networks, well, you have a very rich literature to look at. And sometimes you feel even overwhelmed. And is it really possible that in 2024, you can write a new paper on the contractivity of neural networks that has not... And another thing is the word contracting dynamics is very arbitrary, and people have studied exactly the same problem with 10 different names, or maybe even 20. So I can separately, there are slides on my website where literally 10 different names for the contractivity condition that involves the vector field without taking derivatives of the vector field. There are 10 different names used in the literature. And there's another 10 for conditions that use the Jacobian of the vector field. So now you look at this enormous body of literature and you realize that the nomenclature does not help you. And okay, fine. Nevertheless, The answer is positive. Yes, you can. So yes, there are still open problems, and in exactly trying to show that one could argue systems that are Lyapunov stable, well, in reality, under some mild assumptions, they're contracting. And if they're contracting, then you get much stronger versions of all of the stability properties, robustness, compositionality, and so forth. So you really do want to establish those contractivity properties. Right? Sometimes I make a joke that if you are to study, is the model well posed, but does it have an equilibrium? Is it stable? How does it respond to delays, noise, unmodeled dynamics? Those are 10 different questions. And if you're able to instead answer the contractivity question at the very beginning, you've automatically answered all of the following 9 questions, right? So maybe you want to look at that. So in the case of neural networks, we found early papers, we found later papers, we wrote papers ourselves in which you try to answer all the questions I briefly hinted at now. And it has been, again, a very exciting journey with a new batch of very talented PhD students. Well, Saber was my postdoc, and Sasha is my current PhD students, and Veronica, and Anand, and others. I apologize now, I'm improvising quickly. And I hope that as I do write these documents and try to disseminate the field, that this area will receive increasing attention.
I will add to that also that I will link in the description of the episode a wonderful series of lectures that you've put out on YouTube. Particularly enjoyed watching them together, of course, with another book that you wrote, Contraction Theory for Dynamical Systems. There will be a link in the description. I'd like to spend a bit more time on smart grids, power networks, and networks of coupled oscillators. You've been working on this subject with many important figures in your life, but also, I believe, for the control community, one of which is Florian Dörfler. Another one is John Simpson-Porco. I'd like you to maybe spend a couple of words about the body of work that you've been doing together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so I was very fortunate to have Florian and then John, just like I said also about the other talented PhD students in my group, join my group and collaborate with me and have an opportunity with them to explore new fields. And so Florian, as I think I mentioned earlier, came to me having already published on formation control and robotics, right? And he was very creative and very ambitious and capable of looking at new areas and coming up with new problems. And so early on, I remember a conversation where he taught me about Kuramoto oscillators, right? And this wonderful truth that the interconnection of synchronous generators in power grids, and we're mostly talking about a transmission grid, so the high voltage, high power, are described by something called the swing equations, which were classic or are classic in the field of power grids. But at the heart of the swing equations, there's a nonlinearity, which is precisely the basic idea of a Kuramoto oscillator. So this idea that if you have 2 angles and 2 nodes on a circle, they push and pull each other in a way proportional to the angular differences through the sinusoidal of the angular differences. So this in power grids is known as the power law or the angle law, describing how much power is transmitted on a single line of an alternating circuit, and that is proportional to the sinusoidal function of the angular difference, right? So this wonderful intuition, this connection between 3 different fields, multi-agent systems and consensus, and then power grids, and then this field of coupled oscillators is what was at the top of our minds in those years, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, when Florian was here at Santa Barbara. And we wrote a sequence of papers trying to understand exactly, trying to characterize what is the main question in the study of these coupled oscillators. So the main question is understanding what is the behavior that you get out of these coupled oscillators. And because coupled oscillators exhibit, in general, very rich behavior. But one simple phenomenon that you want to understand, and it's super useful to understand in the context of power grids, is that of synchronization. So you have objects that are running around a circle. Are they running around the circle at the same velocity at the same frequency now. We're talking about angles over time, right? Are they running around the circle with the same frequency? So now we would say those oscillators are frequency synchronized. They're synchronized in frequency. Or even more strongly, are they running around with the same angle at the same phase? So now they're really all clustered together and they're running around as a single cluster, right? So that would be phase synchronization. So in dynamical system, a lot of people are interested in the phase synchronization problem. But motivated by power grids, we were interested in the frequency synchronization problem. And the reason being is that the one I mentioned before, on a power line, the amount of power that you transmit is proportional to the angular difference. So if you have that angles are all equal, then in fact there is no power flowing along the lines. So that's not a very useful operating condition for a power grid. You're not transmitting any power. Instead, in a power grid, there are generators and consumers. And what that means is that the generators are pushing the energy into the network, are forcing the network to oscillate, and the consumers are drawing the energy from the network and they're slowing down the network. So you have this push and pull. And when is it true that in fact there is this elegant, important, critical balance between generation and consumption? Not only the balance, but the existence of an operating condition of the power grid, which in the coupled oscillator network corresponds to saying that they're frequency synchronized. They're running at the same frequency. So that's what the condition. And it turns out that if you are given a fixed power grid with given ability of the lines to conduce a certain amount of power, so each power line has a maximum amount of power that can be conduced on that line, that can be transmitted, above which the thermal limits and so forth will make the line fail. So you have a network whose task it is to transmit energy. There are constraints due to this capacity of the lines. There are constraints given by the physics. You need this coupled oscillator network to be synchronized in the frequency variable. And it turns out that if you keep increasing the power generation and the power consumption, sooner or later, you will reach a point of bifurcation where there will simply be no more existing solution. There will be no operating condition. So as a function of the amount of power that you wish to transmit and the capacity of the network, you find a critical value above which there is no more solution and below which you have an operating condition. This also gives you a notion of robustness. How close do you want to operate your network to that critical point? Probably not all that close, right? You probably want to be sure that as random variations occur, that you don't accidentally cross that bifurcation point. So the very first paper we wrote was entitled On the Critical Coupling for Kuramoto Oscillators, right? And that now you understand the meaning of the title. And in a later paper, we used the word non-uniform Kuramoto oscillator to explain the fact that while in dynamical systems theory and mathematics, perhaps you define Kuramoto models in a way whereby each oscillator is equal to each other. So there is the same collection of oscillators interconnected. Motivated by power grids, it's very important to understand that some oscillators are injecting power, they're faster, and other oscillators are withdrawing power, therefore they're slower, and so they're non-uniform. So you really want to talk about the synchronization problem in that regime. And so we kept working at this, understanding this critical coupling, and then perhaps the paper that, when Florian was here, we wrote many, many remarkable papers, but there is a paper in PNAS, which there is also a survey in Automatica, but the paper in PNAS, maybe let me point to that, which leads to a nice story, a nice achievements that we had in that area. And then, since you also mentioned the name of John joined my group a little bit later than Florian, but the two of them were still present simultaneously. And John became very interested and wrote a large number of fantastic papers as well while he was here. And the one that I am most happy, let me just pick one, was with Florian, and it's entitled Voltage Collapse in Complex Power Grids. And so here, it's like that old saying, everything changes and everything remains the same. So instead of looking at the frequency of the voltages, you look at the amplitude of the voltages. Instead of talking about something called real power, you look at the dual problem of voltages and reactive power, and you get a dynamical system where there are no oscillators, but still it has a number of analogies with spring networks and with other multi-agent systems that we had studied. And so in that paper, John and Florian were able to, again, understand the existence of this critical point above which you have collapse and below which you have a well-behaved operating condition. And so this was the theme of some of these works, understanding these operating conditions. And we also wrote paper on averaging and proportional integral control, all sorts of other exciting things. And with Florian, we wrote paper on Cron reduction and optimality and so on and so forth. So it's very exciting and rich set of topics.
Well, certainly very interesting. On my end, one clarification for the audience. What is a Kuramoto oscillator, since we talked about it until now?
A Kuramoto oscillator is a system in which you have, think about n people running around in a circular square. And some people are faster, some people are slower. But then people want to talk to each other. And so if I am behind you, maybe I will speed up a little bit and you will slow down a little bit so that we can be together and we can talk. But then in other cases, you're simply so much faster than I am that we will not remain, closely connected. And so now you have n runners around a circle and they feel this attraction to each other. But on the other hand, and that's the force that would bring them to be cohesive, maybe even in phase. So there is this attraction proportional to the sinusoid of their angular difference. But then, because they're non-uniform, they have different speeds, that's the phenomenon that would bring them to become separated. And so this little analogy of the runners, you can build on it, and there are a number of other analogies. And Kuramoto oscillators, the simplest, iconic example of coupled oscillators. Coupled oscillators pervade science and nature. There are countless examples of, synchronized fireflies, the synchronization of the motion of planets around the sun, the synchronized behavior of certain circuits, and so forth. There's a long list of examples, not to mention, perhaps the most important of them all, in our brains, neurons fire and get synchronized, or perhaps they get out of phase in a very useful way, right? Because cognition arises from the interaction of an extremely large number of coupled oscillators. So as I said earlier, synchronization is only the most basic of phenomena that occur in a network of coupled oscillators. But one would argue, in fact, cognition is another of such emerging phenomena in a network of coupled oscillators, which are our brains.
Wonderful. And as you say, I'm thinking about many different directions now where we can spawn. So one of them would be neural networks. Another one would be networks that are perhaps a bit more different. For example, social networks. I'd be curious to dig into the last one, actually. So social networks. I'm curious about how did you get interested in the whole subject?
I had a bright and talented PhD student. Her name is Anahita Mir-Tabatabae. And Anahita and I were trying to understand the field of mathematical sociology, starting from a purely controls systems theory point of view, and working with these models, these consensus models that have become so widely known in the control community. So basically, here you have a group of individuals with an opinion, which is a scalar number, just a number. Maybe, let's say, the likelihood that it rains tomorrow. And you have in mind a number, 50%. And I have in mind another number, 75%. And then suppose we interact and we exchange opinions, and perhaps our opinions change. So then what is the new opinion that we are going to have? If I say 75% and you say 50%. So what's the new opinions that you will have and that I will have? And it turns out that actually sociologists were interested in this problem long before long before many other disciplines, long before control people were doing consensus algorithms, long before power systems engineers were doing synchronization, long before many other. So in the 50s, they were writing books on this phenomena, on these averaging models, right? So it turns out that empirical evidence is that when people exchange these opinions, in fact, the new opinion will be a combination of the previous opinion, so 50 and 75. So perhaps if I started at 75 and I hear your arguments, perhaps I will change that to 70. And you started at 50, and then after discussing with me, maybe you will agree, maybe you will begin to think that it's maybe 57. So as you see, there is a contraction of the ranges of opinion. You start from 50 to 75, it becomes 57 to 70, or whatever the numbers. There's the shrinking. There's a tendency towards consensus, towards agreement. In the most basic of models, there is this averaging model where you have, again, we're trying to decide the temperature. I give you some influence and I retain some influence, and then I come up with a new number, which is a convex combination in jargon of these opinions. So now, this is the very basic model. Over two agents, you could have, it's easy to generalize that over multiple agents. And you get a model which involves something called a stochastic matrix, which is very similar to the type of models that people had studied in the context of stochastic algorithms and Markov chains. But okay, that's yet another story. So now, this model of averaging algorithms that lead to consensus received an enormous amount of attention in the systems of control literature, and 1,000 different variations were studied, which is fine. And I did some of that work myself, and we published on something called the bounded confidence model, where, for example, let's imagine that instead of temperature, you and I are discussing politics. So now the subject is more sensitive. Maybe I am willing to talk to you if you are like-minded with me. So I still say 75, you still say 50, but you're still positive. Somebody else saying minus 50 is somebody who has a completely opposite political opinion. And perhaps the consequence is that I don't exchange the opinions at all with somebody who has a very, very different opinion from mine. So there are something called confidence ranges, and they're bounded, and I interact. So you and I may meet, and I will exchange my opinion with you and change my opinion only if your opinion is within a given range and value of my opinion. So those are now nonlinear models. The interesting thing about these models is that you can sit down and think about it yourself, and you can think, do I do that? Is that the way my brain functions? So, I'll leave that open as an open exercise for the listeners. Do you, when you talk to your friends and colleagues or acquaintances about various types of topics, what do you do? And to be clear, it depends upon the topics, because if you are talking about the weather, it's one thing. You're talking about what color do you like for your car, it's another type of issues. If you're talking about politics and if you're talking about ethical values, now that's another story. If you're interpreting the news under your political and value systems, then it's a separate stuff. Or yet another one. Suppose you're talking about intellective issues. What's an intellective issue? It's an issue in which there is a truth. So mathematics is an example. If you're talking about mathematical problems and you're exchanging opinions about a mathematical problem with somebody, well, you know what? There is truth and there is a falsehood. And there is a mechanism whereby you can reach the truth or the falsehood. So in fact, when you're exchanging opinions about an intellective issues, perhaps you're maybe even communicating this mechanism. And then, all right, so by the way, if I have a medical problem, I go to the doctor. I go to maybe two doctors. Why? Because I trust their expertise in the subject, and I don't listen to random opinions I read on the web, right? What does that mean? That means that you are listening to multiple sources. Maybe you have even your initial opinion, and you decide consciously to accord influence to an expert rather than a non-expert. So when you're talking about intellective issues, it's important to understand that expertise plays an important role in determining the weights in this model. So if you're talking to a doctor about a medical issue, you accord to that person a lot of influence. And if you are talking to a person you randomly met in the hallway, perhaps a lot less. If you're a rational individual, that is to say. So in mathematical sociology, people are interested in understanding how do opinions evolve through interactions among individuals. It is a very rich field, right? I just discussed two models. One is very simple, averaging opinions. Another one was nonlinear. I average opinion only with the ones near me. But then I also started to wade into a more complex topic, which is, okay, you exchange opinions and you do some averaging. Okay, I understand that. That's fine. 50, 75 becomes 57, 67, whatever. But how do you decide how much to change your mind or not when you're exposed to new information? How do you integrate it? And what are the bases, the antecedents, the cause you to willingly change your opinion? And so there's yet another field of investigations, right? It's what are the causes? And with Anahita, but also with Noah, the social scientist whom I met and I worked with for a decade, maybe I can point out one work which we did together, which has to do precisely with this source of power. So what does power mean? Power means you are a powerful individual in a social network if the following happens. Your opinion, your initial opinion, tends to dominate the conversation and being the one that is adopted by most other people in the conversation, right? That's the notion of social power. It is the extent to which your opinion wins the case, wins the argument over the other opinions. That means you have social power. So in the context of medicine, if you have a disease, perhaps you should accord influence and social power should go to medical doctors, right? Now, when it comes to a major worldwide epidemics, our politicians may or may not agree that in fact we should be listening to doctors. Is that a rational argument? Is that non-rational? I mean, I don't want to go into politics right now, but to what extent do all doctors express absolutely accurate and correct opinions, or do they themselves have cognitive biases that lead them to offer one opinion versus another, right? When you integrate their opinions, do you do that in a rational way, or do you yourself have some cognitive biases that affect your decision-making? So these are all things that are bordering between mathematical sociology, but also cognitive sciences. So here is a cognitive behavior that apparently we have and that we were trying to write some mathematical models for and investigate. So suppose you meet with your same group of friends over a relatively long period of time, and each day you meet, you discuss a certain subject. So then here's the following phenomena. If on any given day, for whatever reason, you actually win the argument and you convince your friends of the correctness of your opinions, it turns out that the day after, you will come to the same group of people and behave in a more assertive way. You will be more convinced of your own opinion and more closed to interpersonal influence. And if instead, on the day before, or maybe on a sequence of days before, every time you offer your opinion, your group mates neglect it and discard it and do not give you attention, then it turns out that after a while, you will be discouraged, you will be disengaged, and you will ultimately not trust your own opinion as much. You will be more reliant upon interpersonal influence. And so this is an interesting dynamical system that has to do with the evolution that describes the evolution of interpersonal influence and social power in a network. And so this is a fun set of problems to ask yourself. How would you talk to a social scientist or a cognitive scientist and try to understand the phenomena that they qualitatively have observed and then turn that into mathematical formulas and quantitative models that allow you to make predictions that allow you, that can be verified on the data, that allow you to make predictions over longer periods of time, over larger and more heterogeneous groups, over different types of issues being discussed. So that was the challenge that we confronted ourselves with. And I would say the paper I like the most is the one on opinion dynamics and the evolution of social power, which appeared in Science Review with Noah, which is actually our first paper together.
So just a quick comment and then swing question also on this subject. The comment is related maybe to the models that you've implicitly hinted in towards. These are models that go under the name of French model, I believe, the Groot model, the Friedkin model, also eponymous from Noah Friedkin, the person you've just mentioned now. The other thing that I want to mention is, again, there will be a link in the description to the paper that you just mentioned on SciAm Review, Opinion Dynamics and the Evolution of Social Power in Influence Networks. The question that I have is a bit broad, but I guess it has to do with the control theoretic mindset that I have. So far, we seem to talk about systems that are closed, so that are not affected by inputs. But in today's society, we interact with lots of different types of social media. These social media are proprietary, so somebody owns them. They may have different interests. How do these models can be used, say, both in a positive and negative way? Or can they be used?
Oh, that's a tough question, Alberto. I remember thinking to myself that these models are so simplified that, probably they don't have much predictive value. And yet again, it is clear that these very large corporations that gather data about us are capable of making predictions. In fact, they are in the business of making predictions about our behavior and influencing our behavior. And they're clearly successful at it, as their commercial success and cultural success indicates. I think that these mathematical models that I have worked on and that many of us have worked on are still a little bit far away from being able to be directly relevant. I imagine that at these corporations, there are scientists and engineers, software developers, who may well be informed by some of these models and some of this understanding, and then who design algorithms to control the data being displayed to you, the recommendations being displayed to you, and so on and so forth. I myself haven't had a chance to work in that particular world, so perhaps I'll keep my answer short and leave it at this, Albert.
Well, I think we're slowly drifting towards the end of this episode. I really want to allow myself to go on a tangent. The tangent is on book writing, if you wish. So the nexus between education and research. You also served as a president of Control Systems Society. One of the editorials that you wrote that I particularly liked is called Getting It Right. And that had lots of pointers that I found particularly fascinating. I'll mention two, and then I'll ask you your opinion on how to write. So the first pointer is to Richard Hemming, which seems to be a recurrent figure in your quotes. This is from the lecture, You and Your Research. I'll put a link in the description, of course, which says the following: books which try to digest, coordinate, get rid of the duplication, get rid of the less fruitful methods, and present the underlying ideas clearly of what we know now will be the things the future generations will value. And the second quote that I particularly liked, I think, is from Donald Knuth and co-authors, which says the following: so mathematicians who merely think great theorems have no more done their job than painters who merely think great paintings. So both of these are fantastic, but as I said, I'd like to ask you, what's your take on how to write a book and how to best achieve also the goal of service, dissemination, and writing in general?
Thank you for the question. I find this task to be as challenging as anything else I do. I find it really enjoyable and yet at the same time very challenging. So I look back at my old books and I open up a random page. I'm like, I cannot believe I did it this way. I'm never satisfied with what I've done. But basically, the old classic model of writing a book is the model which I also followed for my first book with Andrew, whereby you worked on a field, you've developed a collection of ideas, you're ready to write. The ideas are in their utmost perfect shape, and then you dedicate 24 months of your life every vacation, instead of going skiing, you go write a book. And you write out 750 pages, very carefully thought out, of a field that you have come to fully know. And after you do that, my personal experience is that you are a little bit exhausted and that you don't touch Riemannian geometry for another 15 years in your life, or 10, put it that way. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is very valuable and worthy exercise, and it definitely makes sense. There is another modality, there's another approach, and there's another quote that comes along from Mark Twain, something along the lines of, I prefer continuous improvement to delayed perfection. And lately I've been following this mind frame a lot more. So I enjoy teaching. I enjoy writing research papers on related topics so that I can fully understand an area, and then I can document it and teach it. And that is an incremental process, not a, I've done it all and now finally I will push it out. So the first book I wrote with this spirit was the lectures on network systems. I taught that course 10 times in a row over 10 years. I was invited to, I had an opportunity to deliver this course at various places around the world. And because I was doing research on this very same topic of network systems, every year I would, with a graduate student, we would write a new paper. I have a new idea, learn a new few basic facts, and add a few examples and exercises, or maybe every once in a while add a section or add a chapter. And I kept doing that for 10 years. I would review a paper. You review a paper asked by any of the journals in the area, and you, with an open mind, ask yourself the question, wow, this is a wonderful paper. What can I learn from this paper? Did they do it in the same way in which I would have done it? Or what is the new lemma, the new basic idea that can be incorporated? And I find that quote that you mentioned on this idea of digesting, collecting, unifying, even doing archaeology on where the ideas were originally conceived, and then finally generating a document that captures the main results and organizes them. I find that to be very satisfactory, very well worthy of my personal engagement. When I look back at my education, I think this is something that I saw in Jerry Marsden at Caltech when I was doing my PhD. He had this incredible ability and of a knowledge of spanning multiple disciplines and providing a unified vision in an elegant and thoughtful manner. So for the lectures on network systems, I use this incremental approach, and this is also in keeping with the times. Right now, I don't want to mention any particular company. I don't mean to advertise any company, but it is possible to print a book on demand, right? You order the book, it gets printed, and you can therefore have a version 1. See, in the classical publishing world, you have version 1, then you have version 2. And book version 1 is $100 and version 2 is $150. And there's a reason for it, and version 2 has to be very different from version 1. The traditional publisher would not allow you to change very little. Instead, with this print on demand, there is really no reason why we could not have version 1.1 and version 1.2. And then on the third year you teach the course, it's version 1.3, and so on and so forth. And it's an incremental process. And whenever people email me corrections and new ideas, and typically at the end of teaching the course one more time, I very likely push out a new version. The books are freely downloadable from my website, the ones to which I still own the copyrights. Let me come back to this point. And therefore, if you want version 1.7 of the lectures on network systems, it's available on my website right now. If you want, you can buy the book. The price is relatively low. And, hopefully people are not upset at me. They bought version 1.3, now on version 1.7. There is a careful list of changes that I maintain. And again, it's easy to download and it's relatively inexpensive to buy. So I have enjoyed this incremental model, and it has been critical in my education and research. I've been able to teach, and I have to be very thankful to UC Santa Barbara and my department and my colleagues for allowing me and the students who enrolled in the course, so that by teaching the same course repeatedly, we together, essentially, although I guess I'm the author and I own the copyright, but together we have improved the document. So the other thing I like about this print on demand and self-publishing is the fact that you continue to own the copyrights to your work. And so for young scientists out there right now, I would really suggest to you to keep in mind this concept of who owns your work, who owns the copyright to your work. Sometimes, people will say, you have a book with Jorge and Sonia, or you have a book with Andrew. Well, that's true. We have a book. The book does not belong to us anymore. The book belongs to the publisher. We signed away our copyrights. So I cannot reuse any single piece of any of those documents. I basically gave it away. It's not mine anymore. It belongs to them. And this idea of, I can mix and match books now, right? I can take a chapter from a book and another chapter from another book and write a third book because all the copyrights continue to belong to me. Yeah, so this is a rich question you asked me, Alberto. So I've talked to you about my philosophy on book writing and the connection between research and teaching, because, again, as I develop these lecture notes on various topics, it's because I'm teaching a course, and after the course has been taught, we typically write papers on those ideas with my students. It's very much a push and pull, like a feedback system. And and then in your question, you also mentioned my experience as a president of the Control System Society, and so that's a separate story. I don't know. Do you want me to go into it, Alberto?
Absolutely.
All right. So the other task, the other set of challenges and aspect of being a professor in the modern world is that not only do you teach and mentor undergraduate and graduate students and postdocs, not only do you write research papers and think of new research problems and write research proposals, and then you travel the world to deliver a talk, but also you do live in an environment called a university where there is a large number of committees dedicated to various potentially important purposes. And we live in an environment where we're lucky to have well-organized professional societies, learned societies, non-profit learned societies. Non-profit, this goes along with the idea of the copyrights in a way. So this idea of working and volunteering your time for a non-profits entity, I think is very important for people to understand. Yeah, and so one very well-organized entity is the IEEE, the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And this institute is organized in around 50 societies and councils, and one of them is the IEEE Control System Society. And so these societies, this is volunteer work, right? It's non-profit volunteer work that professors and scientists agree to perform. And then, of course, there is some staff also paid by IEEE. So IEEE is made of both volunteers and paid staff. But in IEEE, all of the important decisions are made by volunteers. So if there is anything that you dislike about IEEE which is non-profit, anything that you dislike, sign up, run for an election. You can be elected to be all the way to be president of IEEE. And if there's anything you wish to change, go right ahead. And don't complain about, somebody making a terrible decision. Well, it was some other faculty before you who decided to invest the time and get elected. And, they thought that was the right decision to take. So now, similarly, it's true in your department on campus, right? There are students, there's staff, and there are faculties. And then there are administrators. And typically all administrators at UC Santa Barbara, essentially the main decisions are made by faculty. So don't be unhappy about anything in your university. Go fix it. If you're faculty, go do it. So I, parallel to my teaching and my research activities, I, served as in a number of preliminary roles in graduate admission chair of the graduate program in my department. And then I was asked to serve to run for election in the board of governors. So the society, so people look at it, professional societies, and look at the universities, and they look at all of these committees, and they look at all of that. What people sometimes don't understand is that because this is all volunteer work, at the end of the day, there is a need to build memory into the system. So the IEEE Control System Society has a number of roles, and they overlap, and they last multiple years. And 1 year you're in charge of publications, 1 year you're in charge of member services, 1 year you're in charge of finances, 1 year, whether it is for the whole society or for a conference or for the journals. And then slowly but surely you accumulate the knowledge to be able to then, in fact, become president or become general chair. So that's why there are all these titles and all of these, apparently Baroque institutions. And it's really the ultimate achievements are organizing conferences with 2,000 people just out of volunteer work, which is impressive if you think about everything that has to be done on a time frame and so forth, with volunteers that keep changing. And then at a different scale, if you look at the IEEE scale, now we're talking about 50 councils. I believe the Institute has yearly revenues in excess of $500 million, a large number of volunteers. And there's a ton of volunteer work that goes into that. And so that's another well-worthy area where you can invest your energies. And I find it, propedeutic, synergistics, whatever the word you may want to choose, it's helpful. It's helpful. It helps you understand processes and relationships and achievements, administrative achievements inside these entities. So I had a chance to do all of that, and it was great. I was chair of my department. I was president of CSS, the IEEE Control System Society. Then I was also elected as chair of the IFAC Activity groups and systems and control. Right, and then I did some work locally at Santa Barbara before, and then I did all of this work for professional societies, and now I'm again more involved inside the university. So this is all part of the life of a modern faculty member.
It's a great preview also for future faculty members. I'm very impressed by the robustness, if you wish, of the whole system IEEE that you mentioned before, given the fact that the components, as you said, are changing on a constant basis. There are a few sets of questions that I tend to ask to every person that comes on the show. One of them is advice to future students, and the other one is about the future of control. So I'm curious to hear your opinion on both issues, pun intended.
So this is a great question. I'll tell you an anecdote. When I was young, I went to the CDC, the main conference, and I approached all of the colleagues whom I thought were the, absolute leaders of the community. I asked Steve Morse, I asked Brian Anderson, I asked Alberto Isidori, I went and John Doyle and Shankar Shastri. I just went and I asked everybody. Two anecdotes. First anecdote is that they all looked at me and they said, I don't know. If I knew what's going to be relevant 5 years from now, I would be doing it right now. So in fact, what I'm doing right now is my best guess of what I believe will be relevant a few years from now. And so, right now, I'm working on neural networks, and I'm trying to be relevant in the field of machine learning, and for obvious reasons that your audience does not need me to repeat. At the time, people were adamant. The joke was, I have no idea. I mean, I think the world is to be conquered, One thing I know is that this job is a dynamic job, right? We discussed, you and I, over this episode, how many different topics I've had a good fortune of having the ability and the opportunity to work on since the mid-90s when I started to do this work. So in 30 years, I've written on many different topics. And that's because my interest, but also interest of the community, are dynamic. So be ready to reinvent yourself. Be ready to learn a new language. I learned the language of Lie groups and Riemannian geometry, dynamic vehicle routing, art galleries and computational geometry, mathematical sociology, power grids and the power law and angles and all of the way nowadays I'm working on neural networks. And so contraction theory is something that 10 years ago I wasn't even informed about what it was at all. And yet today it occupies my scientific work to a great extent. So you need to be ready to change. I think you need to keep an open eye to what are the trends in our field and outside. I mean, I also think you need to have a vision. So in chess, they say it's best to have a plan, even if it is a bad plan, rather than having no plan at all. Then you're guaranteed to lose. So, you have to have a vision, and it doesn't need to be perfect, and it is supposed to evolve. You have to have a plan and dedicate yourself to it with energy and enthusiasm and persistence, because, of course, the problems are not easy, and there's a lot of literature that you need to be aware of and look at. Now, regarding the future of the field, let me mention that when I was soon graduated and I got my very first faculty position in the late 90s, I went to the CDC, and it was a terrible moment. People were absolutely concerned about the future of the field. There was a feeling of impending doom. The field, control was dead. There was nothing more to be done. I went to a special session at CDC where the leading luminaries in the field were describing, were trying to confront themselves with the fact that we had overpromised, under-delivered, that all of the control problems that we had thought of had been solved, and there was not much else to be done. And the field was on an irreversible decline. I came out of that session truly worried about my scientific career. I was very, very concerned. So then, 6 months later, I went to the International Conference of Robotics and Automation, the IEEE ICRA, the main conference of robotics. And lo and behold, there was a session entitled The Future of Robotics, where the luminaries in the field of robotics were describing, in very much the same terms and the same adjectives, the impending doom in the field. Everything in robotics that could be done had been done. We had overpromised and underdelivered, and the field was in inexorable decline. And trust me when I tell you that I was the only person in the room who was smiling, meaning to say everybody else was genuinely concerned about, the end of robotics. And I was thinking to myself, okay, I think that the rumors of our deaths were vastly exaggerated, both in the control and in robotics. By the way, I picked robotics. I don't mean anything negative about robotics. In fact, then at that time I was interested in robotics, and then I kept working on robotics, and then my personal interest have led me somewhere else, but that's irrelevant for the story that I'm trying to convey. So now clearly it is true, however, that the problems that were relevant in that period and the problems that are relevant now have changed completely. And so you do need to be ready to change. And what will the problems in the future be? I don't know. Maybe we will have the current breed of machine learning, a foundation model that does control. Maybe we will use control theory to design better large language models. Or maybe not. Maybe machine learning will change drastically, and maybe we will have completely different problems to look at in the future. It's very exciting to ask yourself these questions. I don't have a precise answer, but I do know that our tools and our mind frame will surely continue to be relevant. And I do wish all of your audience great success in pursuing their individual research plans in the future.
Well, on this note, I think it would be nice to close this episode because it's a very positive one. Thank you so much for having accepted the invitation to join us on the show. It's been a real pleasure, Francesco.
My pleasure. Thank you all, and bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.